written by a local, well, an Oregonian, and Burns. And so this is a traditional tune nowadays as the last tune when we fiddlers play a gathering. It's called I Hate to Say Goodbye, and it's especially played for memorials and funerals. And I want to introduce the band today. Let's see, I'll start with the guitars. You never get done first. Alan Stultz. His name ends with an S at the end of his last name. I misspelled it in the program. Alan Stultz. Amy Burrow, who is amazing at arranging gigs all over the county. And if you need a gig with any musicians and fiddlers, she's the one. Donna Wynn, who is amazingly versatile in playing in all sorts of things, and including the Scandinavian Festival this weekend. And last and not at all least, Linda Danielson, who is the premier fiddle historian and teacher and leader of fiddle things all over here. You want to ask her anything about Western Canadian fiddle tunes in the 1950s, she's got it, and all sorts of other fiddle history.
Oh, I can give you all kinds of misinformation, too.
Yeah, she is amazing. So Linda Danielson, and she's also one of the fiddlers in the Slow Ponies, which is the Applegate-related group that Shannon Applegate and others have played in for quite a few years. So you hear Linda in person today, and then on a CD later. Thank you. So the last tune, I Hate to Say Goodbye. Thank you very much. Thank you. They're from the Oregon Old Time Fiddlers Association, and they've just told me that the fee that we're paying them tonight, they're donating back to the Oregon Old Time Fiddlers Association. And thank you to David Turner, sitting there, who has been doing our AV. And I had no idea he had this hidden talent that is amazing. Apparently it comes from teaching at the university and having to do all sorts of PowerPoints and technical things. He was AV in elementary school. You got me beat. I was in junior high. Okay. This is in addition to running world-class art museums, writing books about the Long Tom, and all sorts of other historical things. Thank you. Throughout tonight, I'll tell you a little bit more of thank yous for people. Welcome. What a wonderful gathering and a sad occasion. But look, Doug got good weather, good food, and great friends. And look around you. You've been talking a little bit, but look around. You may see folks here you've never met before, and yet you have something in common. That would please Doug for you to find and focus on things you have in common with strangers, with casual acquaintances, with enemies, with friends. My name is Lisa Johnson Ponder. I'm a local historian, honored to be Doug's friend professionally and personally. Tonight you'll hear from others who knew Doug, and midway through there will be a time for others to share briefly about aspects of Doug and their memories of him. To start us off, we have Bob Hart, who will attempt an impossible feat of magic for us. He will attempt an overview of the man we knew as Douglas Card. Come on up, Bob.
We're here today to remember a unique individual who passed from the scene. Dr. Doug Card labored in many places, and from the folks I've spoken to so far this evening, you represent places far beyond Eugene, down to San Diego, and I'm not sure if I go in the other direction if we've got any Washingtonians. I was amazed doing research on Doug to write his obit, or one of the obits, to find out he actually wasn't a native Oregonian. He was born in Washington to a logging family. But he chose to spend his final years in his adopted state and in the Eugene area. He made and left a mark during his time amongst us, and that's testified basically by our presence tonight in this celebration. Doug's long-sought PhD may actually be a record in the annals of the University of Oregon. It took him a long time. He got it in the 1990s, but it started in the 1970s. Took a long time. But the PhD was in sociology, but his passion was actually history and historic preservation. I always gave him a little trouble about that, but that sociology was a little narrow. Born in 1936, Doug was too old to be a hippie. Who can forget that he wore a beret, a well-worn beret a lot? One of his close friends described him, I think best, as a bohemian. Among Doug's varied local history endeavors, in 1996, he served as chair of Lincoln's Applegate Trail at sesquicentennial effort, and therein lies a tale. As part of the sesquicentennial efforts, interpretive centers, a real misnomer, since these were basically pairs of signs set up along the highways, interpretive centers were established at points along the old Applegate Trail southern route. Doug knew that the state's wayside area along US 99W, just south of the Benton County border at Monroe, was such an interpretive center and was slated to be abandoned. He was quite incensed that the State Highway Department had made no arrangements for the two Applegate Trail interpretive signs there to be reinstalled anywhere else. To the Highway Department, they were apparently of no consequence, but not so to Doug. If you all have, most of you probably are familiar with the movie The Raiders of the Lost Ark. I'm sure Doug imagined that the state would take care of the signs, and that scene at the end with the warehouse and the Ark of the Covenant being shoved in. Yeah, at any rate. Doug and a regular sidekick showed up at the county's Fairgrounds Museum that I was associated with one day, and he asked a favor. In his car were the two Applegate Trail interpretive signs that came from the closed wayside, and he asked, would the museum be willing to store them? Well, I said sure until they could be relocated. Right, Doug? Oh, right. I agreed, and the signs consequently were unloaded into the museum's garage storage area. There they sat for an extended period of time. They sat and sat and sat, and no word from Doug as to when or where they would be relocated. Doug's other projects had obviously taken his eyes off this particular ball. Some of you surely remember the radio personality Paul Harvey, okay, and his byline, "And now you know the rest of the story." Well, in this case, the rest of the story is those two interpretive signs that Doug saved from oblivion are still serving the public, but not in their original site. They're across the Long Tom, outside and next door to the Monroe Historical Museum. This thanks to the help of Doug's historical friends like those gathered here tonight. As you may wonder, what was so special about those two interpretive signs? Well, one sign pointed out the location of a mill on the Long Tom, which helped explain the neighboring town of Monroe's significant eventual growth. The other sign located a road junction ford before bridges were common on Oregon roads. Now, wouldn't you think that the association with Oregon's transportation network and roads might interest ODOT? And was ODOT the only government agency involved? After all, this was a U.S. highway. So there may be two governmental agencies involved. Quite frankly, this is probably what so incensed Doug. How could they be so blind and not know they were cutting off their nose to spite their face? And to speculate further, they probably were not amused by one of those irritating hysterians. You've all heard that term, upset about an old sign or two being removed from public view. But those two signs are still on duty because of a dedicated local historian, our friend Doug, who decided to save them when a government agency or agencies just couldn't be bothered. Doug, you're already missed. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, former director of the Lane County Historic History Museum and Society. Our next speaker is the person who created this wonderful slideshow of many scenes from Doug's life, his niece, Allison Card Kelly, who will come and share her perspective.
So I was just telling someone as I was walking up here, it was 29 years plus exactly 1 week ago that we were at this place, Doug and my husband George and I were getting married, and Doug was at our wedding. And it's just kind of apt to be here again and be talking about him, and certainly didn't know that's what would be going on 29 years ago. So I've struggled a lot with what I wanted to say today. I knew Doug as my uncle, and it's nice for me to hear the other stories because I didn't, and to see him in ways that are very different than how I saw him. And we had a complicated relationship because our circumstances were complicated. Our bond was defined early by my father's tragic, unexpected death. I was 6 when he died, and Doug was 28. And the same event made us both never the same. And we really, I think, in some ways struggled with that throughout both of our lives in different ways. We stayed connected, including when my mom remarried. Doug and my second dad got to be very good friends, and we still spent holidays together. And I was really thankful that my family kept those connections even after my dad was gone. Doug was 5 years younger than my dad. He, as Bob said earlier, my grandfather was in the lumber industry. He started off working in a mill. He was one of several children, and there wasn't a lot of money to go to college. But he worked his way up over time into management. And I guess this was something that my grandma was really proud of. She her parents, or her mother, was very unhappy that they were getting married because my grandfather was just a mill worker, and my grandmother's mother did not want them to be married because she had been very unhappy in her marriage and felt like she didn't get what she deserved, and she felt like my grandmother should have married someone else. But my grandfather kind of proved him wrong and worked his way up into personnel management and so on. My grandmother was a nurse before the marriage, and as Doug said, and I think it's probably true, she probably might have been happier had she continued her career. But at that time, that wasn't something that really happened, at least not in my family. And she really poured everything into her family and her gardens. There's some pictures in here that you can see when they lived in Coos Bay in particular. My grandmother was an amazing gardener, and she did really beautiful gardens, to Doug and my dad's dismay to some extent, because they got roped into working in the gardens a lot. Hauled a lot of dirt and all kinds, did a lot of weeding and so on. So the other thing I think that about my family and my grandparents is my grandfather was pretty hard on the boys. He was very hard. He wanted them to get good grades. He wanted them to do well. And the pressure was pretty intense on Doug and my dad. And I think it was especially difficult for Doug because my dad ended up graduating at the age of 16 from high school, and Doug was always being compared to his brother in school as he was growing up. And I think that's something that he was always kind of fighting with a little bit, is feeling the need to prove himself, which is unfortunate because, you know, as you all know and have seen him be very good at what he did and what he loved. But it was a little hard for him. They started off in Washington. The boys were born in Everett. They came to Oregon and started off in Medford, which is where he met Karen. They met in kindergarten and were best friends at that point in time. And, you know, it's very lovely that later in life they reconnected and got together again after, you know, so many years. Kindergarten was a long time before that. So they lived in Medford, then they lived in Eugene for a while, and then they moved to Coos Bay, and that is where some of these pictures, the garden and so on. And I remember my mom telling me they lived in a house on a hill in Coos Bay, and they used to love to play croquet, but they lived on a hill, and so the croquet was very challenging, and they were very competitive. And my mom comes, this is right before she got engaged to my dad, and she's trying to play croquet with these people who are cutthroat on this hill in Coos Bay. She said it was very daunting. Yeah, they were pretty competitive. And also throughout the childhood, animals were really important in that family. There were always dogs, always cats. There's a picture in here at one point of Doug with a bird on his glasses holding a cat with a dog. And they loved animals. Doug frequently had a dog, and I can remember Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners, we always had to put aside food for the dog. And Doug at some point became a vegetarian, but always on Thanksgiving and Christmas he would eat the turkey. He decided that was important to him. He majored in psychology at Willamette University, and I found out later, wanted to be a psychologist, but my grandma talked him out of that. I found this out when I majored in psychology. I became a clinical psychologist, and Doug used to send me cards saying sociology saves. We had a little thing going between psychology and sociology. And then we were both working on our doctorates at the same time. We also had a little contest going about who was going to get finished first. Anyway, one of the things, Doug was always very concerned about social justice and inclusivity. And in 1957, about 3 years earlier, in 1954, Oregon passed an accommodation law which said that people could not be denied accommodations based on their race. And one night in 1957 in Coos Bay, he and a friend, Warren, and a black friend of his, Gus, decided to go out and go dancing. And they wouldn't let Gus in. They said that Doug and Warren could come in, but they wouldn't let Gus in. And it became, I think, a little bit heated between Doug and the owner, and he was, talking about the fact that they needed to accommodate him and so on. And anyway, they ended up leaving, and Gus decided to sue the establishment. And this was in Coos Bay, and finding lawyers who would take a case, in this case, was a little difficult, but they found 2 lawyers who took it to court, and they all testified. I have the transcripts of Doug, or excuse me, not Doug, they couldn't find his transcripts. I have the transcripts of Gus and of Warren and what they said at the time. And he did win the case, and he was awarded $500, but he only saw 50. Warren was saying they kept whittling it down for whatever reasons. And they found out later, because they tried to track Gus down and all these things, they wanted to see what happened with him. And hearing from someone that the judge himself was very racist, and he was finding ways to not give him the money and so on. Anyway, in 2023, the NAACP had a little dinner, and they were invited and commended for their help in this case, because it was actually the first trial for the state's accommodation law. But, that's a big part of who Doug was. And then after college, he joined the Army. Everybody in the family had been Marines, and Doug joined the Army. That was really important to him, to break that pattern and forge his own way. He went to language school and learned German and Russian, and then was sent to Germany. He was stationed there for 3 years, and I think he was doing kind of monitoring communications, Russian communications. And there he met Monica, who then immigrated to the U.S., and they got married at my grandparents'. I was their flower girl when I was 4, and that's kind of my first real memory of Doug, was their wedding at my grandparents' house. And I thought Moni was really cool. I loved her voice. She was German. She taught me how to count to 10 in German. I thought that was really cool. And then they settled in Eugene when Doug started grad school, which was actually in the 60s. And it was during that time that my dad died. And I think that made things even harder for Doug, in terms of, it's kind of hard to compete with a dead person. And, people tend to kind of forget all the bad things when someone dies. And so he was kind of always fighting that demon in a way, which I think was really hard. And I remember after my dad died, him coming, and I had gotten a bike for Christmas, at Christmas, that Doug and Moni had been visiting. And he tried to teach me how to ride my bike. It didn't work very well. But, he wanted to step up and stand in where he could. He had done just about everything but complete his dissertation, and he went to Ohio State and taught at sociology there, and then relocated to San Diego and taught there as well. And he and Monica got divorced. She had several miscarriages, and I think that was really hard on them. I know, and I realized, Doug didn't ever talk about it, at least to me. So I don't know how he felt about not ever having kids, because that was something that they had wanted. And I do know she went on to remarry and had kids. And I don't know. I never really knew how that impacted him. But he was kind of at loose ends in San Diego for a while. And then my grandfather needed surgery, so he came up to Roseburg to help take care of my grandma while my grandpa was having surgery. And my grandfather ended up dying 3 days after his surgery. And so he stayed there and took care of my grandma. And that is where he says his love of history began. Because he would sit, he didn't know what he was kind of sitting around with my grandma. What do they do? And he started going through boxes of her old pictures and her family history. And, my grandma would tell him all about who everybody was and the whole thing. And he became extremely enamored with this. And he found out that my grandmother's grandfather they were from Missouri. And during the Civil War, they were in Missouri, which some people there were Union, some were Confederate. And Doug was very interested in finding out what his great-grandfather was. And he was very pleased to find out that he was part of the Union. And that was really important to him. And he also found a cousin who had started a school there and wrote this really wonderful speech that he gave about the school. And Doug felt very moved by that. He said it brought him to tears, and he felt such a sense of pride, in a sense, and that is where his love of history began. And really, I think at that point, even though he still continued later, he did finish his dissertation, he did teach sociology, his love became history. And, but it stemmed from that, from the family history. He started in Douglas County, getting involved locally there, and then moved up here when he wanted to finish his dissertation, and got involved in history in Lane County and so on. I remember, I was just telling someone, 3 days before his deadline of finishing his dissertation, he called me. And he's like, I can't do it. I have 3 days. And I was like, you can. Just don't answer the phone. He goes, but I'm working on a history project. And I was like, set it aside. Just set it aside. Finish. You will feel so much better if you finish. And he did. And I think he did feel good. And, he did end up teaching as an adjunct at the U of O for a few years after that. But as I said, he really, at that point, history was his great love. Doug was very passionate in his beliefs, and some discussions could get pretty heated. But that's because he cared deeply about his community, about people, about justice, about equality. He felt these things very, very, very deeply and was very passionate about it. He could be extremely stubborn and hard-headed. As I said, I think he never got over his need to prove himself, which makes me sad because he didn't need to. And one of the things that I remember the most about him, and I can still hear it in my head, is his voice. I loved his voice. There was something about it that was, to me, very soothing, very comforting. He could also be very passionate. He had a storyteller's voice, and he could tell a story and get people just right there with him. He was a wonderful storyteller. I wish I'd had more time to listen to more stories from him. And he's the last of that generation in my family. And it feels really strange to be in the world without it. Thanks.
Thank you, Allison, for your heartfelt story and more information about the Doug that you knew and we got a hint of. Our next person got to see another side of Doug. Doug had an outspoken public side, as most of us know, and our honored next speaker knew Doug in that way best and helped shape Doug's public persona. Please welcome Register Guard newspaper superstar photographer Chris Peach.
My name is Chris Peach. I'm a director of photography for the Register Guard, which sounds better than it is, but I'm in charge of the photography and multimedia at the Register Guard as well as the Statesman Journal. And back in 2000, I've forgotten when I started, 1988, I started at the Register Guard here. I came from Idaho. I'm the product of an artistic mother and a journalist father, and I had a bent to be artistic, but I lacked any talent. And so photography became my refuge. And with the journalist father, I was keenly aware that the photographs could become history after a period of time. So I had that background as I came to the Register Guard here in Eugene. And somewhere along the line before Doug published his book, the Register Guard published something, and I've driven it from my memory exactly what it was, but I got a phone call in the photo department from Doug saying that some of what we had written lacked the proper context. Big surprise. And so the one part that I remembered later was how kind he was, that he wanted the facts to be straightened out, but that he was completely understanding of the circumstances. And I immediately factored in that I had somebody for my Rolodex in the future. My whole career has been collecting people that know more about a topic than I myself know. And so Doug and I became friends. We went to have coffee, and I would consult him periodically. I got a copy of his book, and I would consult him about things that I was afraid we might lack the proper context for in the future. And so as the Register Guard began experimenting around with video in the late 2000s, I think, I wanted to become Ken Burns somehow. And I immediately thought of Doug, and I called him up and I said, would you be willing to be my audio track for a looking back piece about Eugene Skinner and the founding of Eugene? And he was immediately on board with the idea. And that was pretty much it. We met down at that replica of Skinner's cabin. And I swear to God, I just put my camera on a tripod, hit the on button, and let him go. And he nailed it. And like Allison said, he had a perfect speaking voice, a complete command of the material. He could just expositorily talk about the topic. I had to cut a few things out to get it down to 5 minutes. But it was a very fond memory. And so when I heard that he had passed away, I immediately went back and drug that out and shared it with the Register Guard and on my Facebook. And then I ended up with all of you guys here. And so we're going to play that again.
The story is he went up on top of the butte that eventually has his name, and he looked around and he saw how if you look all the way around, you're surrounded by a circle of hills. And he said, this makes me feel like I'm down inside of a bird's nest, surrounded by these sides. But this is just beautiful here. And then he supposedly said, you know guys, this is it, this is where I'm staying, this is where I want to be. And this is good enough for Eugene Skinner and his family. He was looking for the perfect spot, and he found it. So how come Skinner and Mary ended up here? They were both from New York. Then they hadn't been satisfied there. They traveled to Hennepin County, Illinois. And he, in fact, had been a cabinet maker, and he was a sheriff for a while. But life hadn't gone well. They'd had 2 little baby daughters die. So they were kind of sad and depressed, still looking for utopia. And they decided to go out west. And so in the spring of 1845, they took off in a wagon train to head to California. And they had an incredible trip. The story, we have diaries from that about how they had to lower the wagons down the mountains with ropes and so forth. The Skinners had almost no money, and Mary actually picked up extra money during the trip. I think it was sewing gloves or shirts or something for the other pioneers, and that's how tough life was. They made it over the mountains, and they made it down, where Sacramento is today, Sutter's Fort. And remember, this is Mexico. Sutter was Swiss, but he'd established this colony. When the Skinner's wagon train with Bristow and some of their other friends arrived, they were immediately taken in by Sutter, and actually Skinner spent that winter working as a carpenter, working for Sutter. By spring, they knew they didn't want to stay there. An American couldn't own land unless he became a Mexican citizen. And, people like Skinner aren't about to do that. They leave Sacramento, Sutter's Fort, heading north. Mary was pregnant by that time. And so Bristow, and I think Dotson was with him, and so there was a party. They headed north. Of course, all by pack and by horse. There was not a wagon road. The California Trail was nothing but a horse trail. They did not come into our side of the valley. They didn't come into Eugene. They continued north, and they settled up there in Polk County by Dallas. But Skinner still didn't feel he'd found the perfect spot on earth. He and Bristow and Dotson started talking, this still isn't right. And so they decided to head back down, and they got off the California Trail there by Monroe, crossed the Lone Tom River, and basically followed River Road down into here. You can see, for example, Skinner Butte easily. I mean, there's something over here. They kept going, and they got down to Pleasant Hill, and Bristow takes this place down there. He loves that. And then Dotson took something someplace up by the McKenzie or someplace, but Skinner still hadn't found his place. So they come right back down here. And he's looking around. At this point, we're talking about still the fall of 1846. At that point, other than Bristow, who was batching it out there at Pleasant Hill by himself, the closest other neighbor was up here in Corvallis. And Skinner was both a good businessman. He wanted a place he could make money for his family, but he also had a big heart, and he was very sentimental about nature. You put it together, he had both an emotional vision, but as a practical businessman, he had it all plotted out. He picked the best spot. It's right there in the trail, great north, south, east, west communication, right on the river, close to the old California Trail. This would be the best town site. This would be the ferry site. A perfect view of on top of Skinner Butte. So he knew what he was doing. When you think of from the very beginning, that cabin there, the first settlers around and on, to grow into the city that it is, it's really fantastic. He had a vision of the perfect spot on earth, and he's going to go clear across North America to find it. And he found it.
That's beautiful, Chris. Thank you. You definitely found a great narrator for your beautiful photography. And I will pause here to put in a plug for supporting local newspapers, photographers, and journalists. Keep your subscriptions and keep being aware, informed, and involved. If everybody had kept their subscriptions, the Register Guard might still look like it did 15 years ago. All right, now we have some other personal friends of Doug's, Shannon Applegate, and the Applegate family is really part of Doug's heart.
I'm Shannon, and this is Daniel Robertson, my long-suffering husband for over 40 years. and my pal. I wanted to mention that before we came today, I called one of our daughters and let them know, Daniel explained that we were going to come to a memorial service for Doug Card. And did she remember Doug Card? And she said, well, I'm not sure. How long ago was that? She said, well, it was in the 80s. And she said, well, I don't know. And Daniel said, don't you remember coming home from school and hearing Daniel and this tall guy named Doug yelling at each other in the kitchen and pounding the table? I said, that was Doug Card. And what was going on was they were practicing the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They were getting ready for quite a production, which I was privileged to be the MC at Umpqua Community College. And Doug was decked out like Abraham Lincoln. He was always a sort of cross between Ichabod Crane and Douglas and Abraham Lincoln, depending on how you were thinking about him that day. So Daniel will tell you more about that because Daniel had the privilege of being Stephen A. Douglas, the devil. I think there's something else I would like to say, though, briefly about Doug. It's not often that you meet someone who really has a passion for the past, for whom the past is as vivid as today. And Doug had that creature of history living in him, crouching in there, ready to spring out in any moment. We could find anything to talk about and give it historical context. And I had pleasant times with him and unpleasant times with him arguing about history. Now, we argued about many things, exactly what happened on the Applegate Trail. I had a little bit of knowledge on that topic. And other topics, but we love to argue about Joseph Lane. And we could both become incensed and enraged. And the gentle side of Doug was this friend of mine who would sit on the couch when we were in Roseburg particularly. We would be very solemn and depressed because he was trying to finish his doctorate, and I was trying to finish Skookum, which I'd been working on for 17 years. And we just agreed that we would try to encourage one another. And we did. He is someone that is an irreplaceable spirit of this place. He knows the, as the Greeks used to say, the genius of place. He knew about this place. And the interesting thing about our personal lives was that I had a time when I was the director of the Museum of History in Bandon, Oregon, and was doing a lot of research on Coos Bay and writing a novel about Coos Bay. And of course, he had lots of ties to Coos Bay, to the lumber industry and all that. And he was, he was a lefty. And we loved to talk about the Wobblies, the IWW. So we talked a lot about that. There wasn't anything that we couldn't cover in about 3 hours. Each of us being remarkably succinct. Anyway, it's really a sad privilege to be able to think about him. And I'll miss him. He brought Karen down to the old Applegate house about 4 years ago, right before all of the pandemic things were going on. And Karen was looking for Oregon songs for a special festival they were going to be involved in. And so Doug and Karen and I were down in the men's side of the old house where the piano was. And I sang him this snatch of a hymn that I knew, that the Wagon Trains sang. And we discussed this, whether they could include this in this collection, and they did. It was called Where Are All the Hebrew Children? Way Down Yonder in the Promised Land. And it was remarkable. We all sang this song. That was the last time that I ever really had a chance to talk to him at length. So there should be thousands of people here. But lucky us, you know. Here we are with Doug in our hearts, and at least I don't have to stand like this. Anyway, this is my pal.
So I had the privilege of coming to Roseburg in 1983 as the director of the Douglas County Museum, and I think I was there maybe 5 days when I got a call from the front desk of the museum saying that there was a guy named Doug Card wanted to say hello. And I came down and greeted him, and thinking I was going to shake his hand and say a few words, and he smiled and he said, "Can't we go sit down for a few minutes?" And Doug introduced himself as a member of the board of directors of the Douglas County Historical Society, and at that time, and in fact still today, the museum was here and the Historical Society was here, and never did the two meet. And so Doug was working on me to find a way to bring the Douglas County Historical Society and the Douglas County Museum together, because that had to happen. It never did, but Doug was definitely determined that it was going to happen. And frankly, I thought Doug had grown up in Roseburg as far as I could tell. He knew a lot about Roseburg history, and he was very, very involved with the Historical Society. We had many, many pleasurable conversations and some unpleasurable conversations. A few times he let me know that I was not doing my job. That was okay. I suggested that I had an advisory committee, and he was more than welcome to come talk with them anytime he liked. But we became quite excited about the possibility of creating a National Register historic district in a small neighborhood of Roseburg called the Mill Pine neighborhood. Mill Pine was little itty-bitty cottages, maybe 600, 700, 800 square foot houses, no big grand Victorians, no lovely mansard roofs and gorgeous houses that were architecturally significant. It was a railroad workers' neighborhood that still existed. All the houses were still there. And Doug, with his social justice vision, was excited about that idea. And we had three lovely women. I was trying to think of one of their names. I can remember the other two, but so I can't remember the third, so I'm not going to say their names. But they became just as enthused, and with Doug's encouragement and my encouragement and some funding from the museum, they went to work on documenting the Mill Pine Historic District. And in 1985, with Doug's help in front of the Roseburg City Council, we got an endorsement from the Roseburg City Council, and the Mill Pine National Register Historic District, the first historic district in the state of Oregon of working class housing, was created. Doug at the time created a little organization called the Douglas County Preservation Society. I have to tell you, there was no Douglas County Preservation Society, but he was the president of it, and it allowed him to speak up as the president of the Douglas County Historic Preservation Society. There is no Douglas County Historic Preservation Society today, and there wasn't then, but he managed to use that. And during this time, he came up with the idea that we should do a reenactment of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And I said, Doug, the Lincoln-Douglas debates were 6-7 hours long. We're not going to be able to do a reenactment of a 7-hour debate. Nobody in the world today would sit and listen to us for 7 hours. And he said, well, we could edit it down. So, by gosh, we sat down together with Shannon, and we edited the Lincoln-Douglas debates down to about 1 hour and 15 minutes. The Freeport debate. And yes, we were in the kitchen rehearsing the Lincoln-Douglas debates for a couple of weeks, maybe 3, maybe 4 weeks. And my kids kept saying, why are they in the kitchen yelling at each other all the time? We finally got it together to realize that it wasn't a matter of yelling at each other. But Doug wasn't satisfied with just being able to deliver the lines. We went to the local not costume shop, but the place where you go and get prom dresses and so on, wedding outfits. And they donated a couple of tuxedos for us, and we dressed up in tuxedos. And Doug read and read and read and read everything he could find about what Abraham Lincoln was like in person and what his behaviors were and what he was when the people saw him. What did he look like and how did he act? So Doug got that all down. He had an idea about how Abraham Lincoln would have appeared on stage. Well, we rented the Whipple Auditorium at Umpqua Community College, seats about 250 people. We decorated the stage with bunting and all kinds of layouts, and we told a man named Peter Wong, who was the political reporter for the News Review newspaper at the time, that we were going to stage this debate. We publicized it, we got it out on radio and PSAs on television, and we filled that auditorium. And we planted 2 or 3 people out in there that knew when a particular line was said in the debate that they were to stand up and yell something back at us. And so we got up there, and every time Doug would tell a joke, he would be talking like Lincoln, and he'd slap his leg and say, tell his joke. And it just broke people up in the audience. They were just rolling in the aisles. And so at one point, when Stephen A. Douglas said one of the most racist lines that he said in the Fremont debate, a person whom we did not even know, no idea who she was, stood up in the aisle and said, "You should be ashamed of yourself, sir." And we knew we'd actually got the audience's attention. And I will end this with the reporter for the News Review went back, and in the next day's newspaper, there was an analysis and report on the Lincoln-Douglas debate at Umpqua Community College, and I'm proud to say Douglas won. So I could not have had a better friend, colleague, adversary, supporter, and I wish he would have been successful in bringing the Historical Society and the museum together. Not to happen, I'm afraid. But we kept in contact with Doug through the years after he moved to Eugene. As Shannon said, they talked a lot about finishing Skookum, finishing his PhD, doing the things he needed to do. He came down and played Lincoln again at the Charles Applegate House, along with a friend of ours named Penny Anderson, who was Mrs. Lincoln. And so he made read a little section of the Gettysburg Address for us. I just can't think of a person as a historian Oh, and I would add one other thing. As a sociologist, he wasn't so darn bad either. He used to take his sociology classes and run polls in the Roseburg area and report the polls to the News Review, and they would run the information about the polls that Doug's sociology classes did. I never saw anybody else who interacted with the public in his professionalism like Doug did. Thanks for letting us share.
Thank you, David. Shannon and Daniel, thank you so much for making the trip here tonight. And your personal memories mean so much to us. The Applegate House is one of the 3 donation places we suggest if you want to donate any money and funds to an organization in honor of Doug and Doug's memory. I have donation cans right up here. There are 3, and there's information and envelopes about them. The Applegate House is a 501c3 and Oregon Cultural Trust qualified. There's also a can for Green Hill because, as we know, Doug really liked his dogs and the other cats, and apparently birds too. So there's envelopes for Green Hill, and then there's on the end, Lane County History Museum, excuse me. And Bob Hart was the director there for a wonderful run. And you've heard from several people connected with history museums. You know they're important. So at this point, we wanted to save a little spot of time for people who wanted to speak, who weren't already on the list. And Danny is top of the list here. Please, Danny, would you lead us off with some open sharing?
So what can I say about Douglas B. Card? Okay. The first time I met Doug was on a day I started repairs on the trailer next door to his. He loaned me electricity in the form of an extension cord to run my saw. From then on, it was like we'd known each other for years. I mean, you know, you meet some people and that's it. The next day you would need to be reminded of their name. And then you meet a person, you could not forget their name even if you tried. The latter was me and Doug. Ever since that day, it has been Doug with his booming voice saying, "Hey, Dan!" and his belly laugh, which I won't try to imitate, but I will never forget. From there out, our relationship developed over food. Ask anybody who knows me, and they'll tell you that if you're around Danny, you'll never go hungry. So it became my routine to make him a plate at dinner. Because Doug was a vegetarian, it made it special to me that I had to make his special, if that makes any sense. About half the time I would sit down and eat with him, and those were the times I got to know him and his many adventures. Those are the times that I will miss the most. The last couple years, it has been Nick and I that were around. Nick's a guy that Doug loved dearly, and I know the feeling was mutual. Doug said something to me on a day when I was feeling overwhelmed with life. I was kind of down. And that it really affected me then, and I'll remember it forever. He said, and I quote, "You know, Dan, it may seem tough right now, but you can take care of the things you can control, let the rest fall where it may, and you'll be okay." And I really took that to heart. It's advice I still follow to this day. That is the advice of a long-lived, well-traveled professor of sociology, author, and a student of life, Douglas B. Card. In his honor, dedicated to, in celebration of his life, I will now share a poem I've written, simply titled, "My Friend Doug." And after I read this, I would encourage anybody who has something to share to please do. So without further ado, this is My Friend Doug by Daniel Dean Young. Okay. Doug, you are a man I hold in high regard, the teacher of many, yet the student of all. At your passing, the tears that will fall will never outweigh the joy you had for life and freely shared with us all. Your laugh, your smile shed light on the world. The light will stay bright through your memory in our hearts. It is a privilege and an honor to say that you were my friend. Happy I could be there to the end. I will miss you. I will forever miss you. Rest in peace, my friend. Love, Danny, the guy next door. P.S. Yes, I'm feeding the birds and the cats.
Hi, I'm Diana Bilevsky, and it seems like there's one segment of Doug's life that you don't know about. That's when he lived in San Diego. So I lived there in the same little community with him for a number of years. And San Diego had this little enclave by the beach called Ocean Beach. We called it OB. And it was a little hippie enclave. And so Doug really was a hippie, by the way, because we all were. It was like we were even though he was about 10 years older than us, we were all baby boomers. We were like the same cohort. We were like brothers and sisters, and we hung with each other, and we'd get up in the morning, and we'd meet at somebody's house, and we'd smoke doobies, and then we'd go over to the Mexican restaurant and have, burritos or whatever, and then we'd come home and go separate ways, and then we'd get together at night again over a fire pit and smoke some more doobies, and that was just normal. But we also would have parties often. And there were always two records we had at the parties. It was The Harder They Come, reggae, and also, you probably don't know this, the Red Star Singers. They only made one album in San Francisco. But we were all very radical. So what happened was we were humming along, doing these things, and then all of a sudden, the investor class decided they wanted our utopia. And so they came in and they wanted to take up all the hotel, the little cottages, like the ones that Doug wanted to save. And so, it's very interesting because a lot of us started out in OB, and that became the sort of the seed of who we became as organizers. I know it did for me, and a lot of other people I know of that same, those like 4, 5, 6 years. Anyway, so they wanted to make OB into Miami Beach. And we said, hell no, that's not happening on our watch. So we all got together and we organized. It took us a couple of years. So Doug was very instrumental in that. And the wonderful thing about Doug is that although we all knew, and he knew, that he knew more than we did, because we were just whippersnappers, we were like in our 20s, and he was in his 30s, he was patient with us. He was gracious with us. He did not say, oh, well, I know and you guys don't know, so scram. No. He would stand back and wait for us and then be part of it. So anyway, over a lot of different organizational things. I remember there was a free food and natural food grocery store. We had all these services that we had developed, that were people serving businesses that weren't in other places at that time. Anyway, I remember there was a little space in the back of this grocery store, and I remember being with Doug, and we were part of the first organizational meeting, writing out what our demands were. Anyway, the upshot was we got to be one of the first places in America that had community control. And Doug was on the first board of that community control organization. That's why I can understand why he said, oh, we're going to have this organization. And no one belonged, but he was the head of it, because that's what we did. We just knew we could do this. But anyway, so those are my memories of Doug. He was just a wonderful guy. And the sad thing is, I just found out that, so I had moved up here 10 years ago. I just found out he lived in this area. And so I was getting all ready to try to figure out how I could meet with him. And then I found out he died from your article in the Register Guard. But I appreciate your words. Anyway, so Doug was a hippie. he didn't have lost years. He was very active. He had a really cute girlfriend. There was a very nice time for him there.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sean Bowles. I was a city councilor for the city of Eugene back before the Earth's crust cooled between 88 and 96. And it was through that I met Doug. Doug could be, as most of you know, both very friendly and very forthcoming, but very firm in his decisions about the world. What Doug showed me was someone who cared deeply about a sense of place. And let me assure you, as a city councilor at that time, there are not many people who share that. There are more in this room than are in most similar spaces. We dealt with those who are interested in the short-term interests of the few versus the long-term interests of the many. And Doug understood the difference, and he worked for it. I knew him primarily through the McNeil Riley House, which he leaves part of his legacy, and through Lincoln School, where he had some wise things to say about how we might go about preserving that place and still providing some housing. So I had actually expected more of the radical / wobblies of my era to be here than are here, and I think it's maybe because they, like our friend over here, are at home smoking a doobie. I gave up that privilege to come here, but I intend to remedy it after I leave. Thank you very much.
My name's Sam Porter. I shared an office with Doug in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where I was a sociology instructor. I taught environmental sociology and sociology of religion. And we had a lot of good arguments in the spirit of Doug, and that's one thing I appreciate about him, his sense of fairness and justice, and but I don't want to talk about that. I want to read something that I kind of want to dedicate to Ms. Kelly, because at the end of her talk, she touched a nerve with me, at least. And what I want to read to you is something that one of my teachers who Doug respected, Robert Bella, he taught at Berkeley for a long time, and one of his main specialties was sociology of religion. And he also wrote a book called Habits of the Heart, Individualism and Commitment in American Life, which was a jury-nominated, prize-winning book about American society and this radical culture of individualism that's led us to what we have now. But here's what Bella said to me about a month after my dad died in 2006. And I hope this is not too inappropriate. But, and there's one thing I'll want to underline at the end of this. Where were you before you were born? That's where you'll go after you die. Well, before I was born, I was in the sperm of my father and the egg of my mother. I had within me the earliest beginnings of the components of 1 billion or more years of life. The genes that I share with worms, a lot, and with mold, some, and the atoms that I share with the universe, all the way back to the Big Bang. So returning to all that isn't so bad. Further, I will join the company of saints, of all those whose cultural work has made it possible for me to have been a halfway decent person. And what I've added to the cultural pool, even when I'm long forgotten, will go on having an influence, unless we become extinct soon, which is also possible, for a long time, perhaps an immeasurable time. As for eternal life, that is now. If we don't see eternity in a grain of sand, when will we ever see it? As for resurrection, as Tillich said, dead men don't walk. But Christ was surely resurrected in the consciousness of his disciples and is more alive today than the day he was crucified in the faces of all those who follow his example and keep him alive. Many wonder workers have resurrected the dead. I never understood those who think the truth of Christianity hinges on the physical resurrection of Jesus. If that is the test, then a lot of nutty religions are also true. Eternal life is here and now. Christians have hardly come to a consensus on life after death. Augustine thought we'd all join the choir of angels in singing an eternal hallelujah. Fine with me, but most Americans who believe in life after death think they will rejoin their dead family members and live happily ever after. a very modern bourgeois kind of afterlife, hardly what traditional Christians thought. But I have no interest in destroying the beliefs of others. If thinking one will rejoin one's loved ones helps bear the pain of death, then I'm all for it. I have to look elsewhere and with Heraclitus declare life and death are one. And the thing I want to underline is that cultural pool to which Doug has contributed a lot that is very significant for all of us here in Oregon. Thank you.
Well, it's nice the dogs are welcoming me up here. It's great to hear all y'all's stories about Doug, and I didn't get to know him as long as y'all did. I met him first maybe 25 years ago at the Oregon Asian Celebration. Oh, I should introduce, my name is Steve Williamson, and most people know me as the Opal Whiteley nut from Cottage Grove, because I'm the Opal Whiteley historian from Cottage Grove and other places. But I've also been the historian for the Oregon Asian Celebration for the last 25 years. And at one of the very early celebrations where I was very nervous about putting my historical research up, Doug Card came, and this is how I met him and his sidekick. And he came and he looked at my display. And you know how as historians we get excited like little kids when we see something new that we haven't seen before. And I had these stories that he had never seen before, and he's jumping up and down saying, "These are primary sources, primary sources." I didn't know what a primary source was at that time. And so we became friends and worked on, I had the great honor of working with Doug on the committee that Lisa Ponder put together, including Bob Hart, Steve McQuitty, and David Turner there. We worked on a new plaque for Skinner's Butte, one that is more historically accurate, and I'm so proud. And Doug did a fantastic, at his age, a month before he died, he did a fantastic speech that he wrote up there. And it did what he did so well. It brought the past and the present together. Lisa printed his speech out in the program. It's the yellow page. And I really encourage you to read it. Just one more little story about Doug. He and I are both night owls. And I was in Louisiana, and I had to catch this plane at like 4:30 in the morning. And I was rushing to clean up this house so I could get the deposit back or get it right for folks. And I knew that Doug stayed up really, really late. So I sent him an email, "Doug, are you awake?" Just like 1 a.m. my time would have been 3 a.m. out here. "Doug, are you still up? Can you talk to me for a while?" And a moment later, the phone rings. And while I'm cleaning the house for about 3 or 4 hours, we are having the greatest long conversation. Because you really could have long conversation with Doug, great ones. Yes. And it's a huge loss, but Doug, with his books, with his teaching, he's left behind a tremendous legacy for us. And I printed out this passage from Opal Whiteley's childhood diary. It's called "The Days of Brown Leaves." It's from chapter 8, and it's probably written in November 1904. Opal was about 6, just about to turn 7 in December. Now, you'll notice her language has a slightly English as a second language bent to it. And if you want to know about that, I can tell you about that later. But she comes by that very honestly. "Now are come the days of brown leaves. They fall from the trees. They flutter on the ground. When the brown leaves flutter, they are saying little things. They talk with the wind. I hear them tell of their borning days, when they did come into the world as leaves. Today they were talking of the time before their borning days of this springtime. They talked on, and I did listen to what they were telling the wind and the earth in their whisperings. They told how they were a part of earth and air before their tree borning days, and now they're going back. In the gray days of winter, they go back to the earth again, but they do not die. And in the morning of today it was that I did listen to these talkings of the brown leaves. Then I faced about, I turned my face to the way that leads to the house we live in, for there was much work to be done. And I submit, folks, that if Doug were here, he would tell us there is still much work to be done. So, Lisa, thank you for organizing this for Doug. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And as you first told that story to me, your goal was not to miss the plane. And you wanted him to keep you up long enough that you would not fall asleep.
Had to be at the airport at like 4:30 in the morning.
4:30.
To go to sleep.
Yep, you were too afraid to go to sleep, but you knew Doug could help you make that plane on time. True friend. There are several people to thank for this gathering. I do especially want to acknowledge the committee of 5 historians that I pulled together for a plaque, and I think Susan, our next living speaker, will talk about it. But David Turner, who's now our AV King tonight as well. David, raise your hand there. David Turner. Steve Williamson, who you just heard. Bob Hart, who you've also heard from. Steve McQuitty, who's in Texas, having to be with his family. Who have I missed? Oh, me. Okay. Well, I know who I'm missing. I'm missing Doug. He was the 5th. Doug was the 5th historian that I pulled together for this project. And so now we were 6, now we're 5. But it's been an interesting journey, and Doug really was pivotal. And for this evening, we also have had the help of Nick Kelly, his driver, helper, etc. His niece, Allison Card Kelly. We've had the help of Chris Peach. Yes. Great photos. And tonight we've had, with the support of the Lane County History Museum, we have from LCC, we have Randy Painter, who is how do we say that? Video recording this event for archival purposes. So it will be available. He's also a volunteer with the museum. We had help from Destination Events, which rented us the equipment. Up here, there's this beautiful painting right here. Jerry Ross spoke. Raise your hand. Painted and you can tell people the story perhaps after, but that is a great photo. Our last living speaker is Susan Miller. And after that, I'll have a couple words, and then we'll have our final speaker.
I actually probably, out of everybody in this whole spot, knew Doug Card the least. I am the former historian and current marker, what's called the Marker and Monument Chair for the Oregon Lewis and Clark chapter of the DAR. And the DAR, of course, was founded over 100 years ago in 1890, and with the mission of promoting historic preservation, education, and patriotism. So our chapter has well over 20 markers that mark historic locations, people of note all over the local area, all the way up to the Mackenzie Ranger Station, where they honor the pioneers that came over the Mackenzie Pass, for the east side of the Territorial Road, which runs out past Coburg, and the west side Territorial, which runs out Franklin and then down through Crow and all over the city of Eugene. Hitching Post Square, which everybody knows more as the park blocks downtown, which is where Skinner and Mulligan gave land for the government to be there. So we have all of these all over, and one of the ones that we just got done redoing the whole thing is up there on Skinner's Butte across from the climbing columns. And if a lot of people don't know that's there because it's just sort of along the side of the road and you can go zipping right by. But if you go up there, stop and take a look because it's a beautiful, beautiful monument and marker for the Skinner Butte cabin. And Skinner's cabin was right over the hill from where that marker is located. It started out 1930. There is a rock and cement marker that was there that got real hidden. It now resides sort of like those signs at the Historical Museum. I think it's in the boiler room, but it's sort of been they took it down because it was falling apart. In about 2000, they picked it up, moved it, and working with the local Rotary Club, they did a nice little plaza. There's some smaller columns there, and the Rotary Club had a plaque, and we had our new Skinner cabin plaque. That about 2020, about in that time, we discovered that someone had stolen both of those plaques off there. And it was there for a while, graffitied and things. We decided, and I came along into the project after Lisa had already been working on it. And that's when they decided that they needed to change the wording. They brought the Calapooians into it. And so if you go take a special trip, if it's not, doesn't take too much, pull over to the side of the road and take a look and see what that looks like. It reads, "In honor of Mary and Eugene Skinner, for whom the city of Eugene and Skinner Butte are named. In October 1846, Skinner built the area's first cabin just west of this spot, uphill from river flooding, following the advice from Calapooians, the long-term inhabitants of the valley. This marker placed in 2026, Oregon Lewis and Clark Chapter, NSDAR, replaces earlier markers placed by the chapter in 1930 and 2001. So do take a stop up there and see, and there. So thank you.
When the DAR approached me to do the historic plaque, and I realized it was an opportunity to reword it, I ended up talking with Doug Card. And he himself had tried 20 years ago 26-something years ago, to try to change the wording so that the Calapooia were mentioned. And he wrestled with different committees and different people in different places and could not get that done. So when I talked to Doug, I said, here's what I have a vision for, new wording with the Calapooia. Yeah! And so he and I had so many long conversations. We already knew each other, but this was a joy. And then when we got finally close to, well, let's say all the historians involved had lots of debates in email about this word or that word. Or what if we say near this, does that exclude the Bristows, or do we have to do such and such? It was wonderful to watch them work. And when we finally got the approval and got the plaque, and I said, we're doing the dedication on this date, would you be our speaker? And he says, yep, got to do it now because I don't know if I'll be around in the fall. And he will be our last speaker tonight. We will let Doug have the last word, okay? We're going to play a video of him giving that speech. But that wasn't the last time I saw him. When he went into the hospital for a procedure, I and my husband went to see him several times, many times. And right after, when he was in ICU, just after the procedure, we had this 2-hour talk. There's a guy in ICU, right, who's come through his procedure. And for 2 hours, he was just exuberant. He said, I thought I was a goner, and I'm here. And he was just talking about all sorts of wonderful things. And he was going down memory lane about his brother and about his sister-in-law and all these people that were important to his life. And his grief about one person that he really wanted to see and couldn't, didn't even know if she was alive. And he and I talked a lot about love and disagreeing with people and just always still loving them and still being in each other's lives. And he talked about how much grief there is in the world that's not optional, that we all live with. We can't get out of how our heart's doing or what the world is doing with climate or wars. But we have so many harms that we cause that are optional. And he talked for a long time about the optional pain we cause each other and how often we can stop that and choose the option of staying in love, staying in community, whether we disagree or not. And he talked a lot about that. And it was just the most incredible 2 hours of an exuberant Doug. And he just kept saying, I thought I was goner, but I'm here. That zest for life, even at that moment, and that joy. And then 2 days later, he was in a different situation. And the next few times I mentioned that we visited him in the hospital. He was sedated. And so that exuberant Doug is the one that I really remember and I treasure, and I hope that all of you will treasure his advice to be connected with each other and love each other. Disagreements are small, but love and community matters. And don't add any optional pain to the world. Let's just add optional love and optional joy. So, our last speaker is the one who's not alive. It's Doug. And so we're going to listen to Doug's last words. And after Doug's speech ends, David Turner, our A.V. King, an historian, will play music by Karen Arlen, Doug's kindergarten friend for life. And then after that, he'll also put in some music by the Slow Ponies, the Applegate folks. And you can, continue to talk or gather up your things, whatever you want to do. And thank you so, so much for being here. Thank you. Douglas Card. Doug, stand for a moment at least. Doug Card is a longtime author and public speaker about local Lane County history, just as he had done for Douglas County decades ago when he taught at Umpqua Community College. When he came to Eugene, Doug taught a course at UO he called America's Peoples. Doug is a dedicated and tireless local history preservationist. If you have ever seen and read local signage in parks about the Applegate Trail, you have seen some of his extensive work. Doug was the chairman and developer of local sesquicentennial events. He has always been an enthusiastic and collaborative partner in local history matters. In 2018, Doug was a worthy recipient of the Lane County Historical Society's award for lifetime achievement in sustained support of state and county history. It is no surprise then that it even lives kind of near the old Applegate Trail. If you want to learn more about Lane County history, Doug Card's book, From Camas to Courthouse, is an excellent place to start. You can get it at the library and bookstores near you. Wonderful.
Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction, and thank you, DAR, for inviting me to say a few words today. I was happy to accept because there are a few thoughts I'd like to briefly mention on this August occasion. Personally, I realize that having recently turned 90, yes, 90, I do have some history to share from many past experiences, and I need to do it when I can. Who knows if I'll still be around next fall for your major program. So I feel blessed to have memories stretching as far back as Pearl Harbor. This gives one perspective. I remember the past, when Oregon truly was a racist state. But I'm blessed to have seen the great progress that we have made since then. I remain an optimist. There are three major reasons why I wanted to do this little talk. First of all, I have to say, I really like the Skinners. They're good people, and the little cabin here on this spot, on this butte, must have been a happy place. Imagine Mary and the Calapooya women playing with baby Mary. I love the thought of the wondrous view, south and north. Skinner recognized the beauty of the butte, saying on top, he felt like he was in a bird's nest, surrounded by these hills. And at this point, I want to recognize the late Ray Wiley, the Dean of Skinner Butte, whose engineering skills helped locate this cabin site. Secondly, there is the importance of history today. We probably have more people interested in history right now than we have had for a long time. It's become controversial and political. We understand the significance of George Orwell's famous phrase that he who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future. It's a thought I worry about a lot when I hear the government trying to tell Smithsonian what they should have for their exhibits. Now, I'm trying to emphasize the importance of good academic bias history. With all our disputes, there are usually good points on both sides. Hard as it is, we need to examine both the good and the bad of Oregon history. That's not easy, for it's hard to deal with the opposites, what psychologists would call cognitive dissonance. And you know, I think this new DAR plaque on Skinner accomplishes that very, very nicely. You did good work on the wording. Back when I was young, our history was all about the winning of the West. Today, I think we're doing a much better balance, acknowledging the losing of the West as well. In fact, perhaps at time, the pendulum was swung a bit too far in the other direction. For example, recently there was a panel discussion held by the EO in our museum on the question of changing the name of our county from Lane to Calapooya. An excellent topic, for the Calapooya deserve recognition. And Joseph Lane was a controversial figure. There was both good and bad in his history. How do we balance those two sides out? Now, while that panel was rather unbiased, it was rather unbalanced, in its unanimous condemnation of Lane, this remains an excellent topic for future debates. So the main message I'm sharing today, try to be balanced, fair, and accurate in your histories, fight for the truth, and don't let any politics or ideology overwhelm that. Now, for the close, I'm going to say that with the Skinners, however, There really are not two sides to the Skinners. They were really good people with none of the Joseph Lane baggage, racism, and so forth. I think we all have a right to be very proud of our founders, and yet be aware that their settling here unintentionally set in motion the changes that resulted when all the California people were removed from our valley in 10 years. So that brings me to Marty Lou, who is our next speaker. Thank you.
I'm old Tom Moore from the Bummer's shore in the good old golden days. They called me a bummer and a gin sot too, but what cares I for praise? I wander around from town to town, just like a roving sigh. And the people all say, there goes Tom Moore of the days of '49. In the days of old, in the days of gold, how oft times I repine. For the days of old when we dug up the gold in the days of '49.
There was old lame Jess, a hard old cuss, who never did repent. He never was known to miss a drink or ever spend a cent. But old lame Jess, like all the rest, to death he did resign. And in his bloom went up the flume in the days of '49. In the days of old, in the days of gold, how oft times I repine. For the days of old when we dug up the gold in the days of '49.
There was New York Jake, the butcher's boy. He was always getting tight. And every time that he'd get full, he was spoiling for a fight. Then Jake rampaged against the knife in the hands of old Bob Sign. And over Jake they held awake in the days of '49.
In the days of old, in the days of gold, how oft times I repine. For the days of old when we dug up the gold in the days of '49.
There was Ragshag Bill from Buffalo, I never will forget. He would roar all day and roar all night, I guess he's roaring yet. One night he fell in a prospect hole in a roaring bad design. And in that hole he roared out his soul in the days of '49.
In the days of old, in the days of gold, how oft times I repine. For the days of old when we dug up the gold in the days of '49. Of all the comrades that I had, there's none that's left to boast. And I'm left alone in my misery, like some poor wandering ghost. And as I pass from town to town, they call me the rambling sigh. There goes Tom Moore upon the shore of the days of '49. In the days of old, in the days of gold, how oft times I repine. For the days of old when we dug up the gold in the days of